Greetings, everyone. I am very excited to again be in conversation with Irene Chong, and we're going to be talking today about some of the archetypes of the sacred feminine and some of the sacred feminine wounds or shadow aspects and how we can heal that as women to come into our wholeness. But before we get into that, let me just remind you about Irene and her work. She is the founder of Alignment Journeys, and I'll include her bio and her link to her website below. But she's a very gifted teacher, coach, healer who does sacred circle work with women, workshops, individual coaching work, really powerful work in empowering women to connect to their sacred feminine wisdom and energy to come into their true, authentic selves. So, thank you for the work that you're doing, Irene, and for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here, always to be in conversation with you.
So let's dive in. We both are really aware of the importance of reintegrating the energies of the sacred feminine wisdom and archetypes in this time. As men and women, we're needing to integrate that, to be moving into the Aquarian age. And you're really focusing a lot on helping women to reclaim those energies within themselves, to be in the fullness of their gifts, in their light in the world, and to be empowered in being heart centered women in this critical time of transition on the planet. But let's talk about some of the archetypes of the sacred feminine. And you were just mentioning some before we got on that are so critical in this time, but it's really important that we understand them in their wholeness. So you were going to talk some about that archetype of the maiden mother crone. So can you talk some about that?
Yeah, and first off, prior to the recording, we were having a discussion that when it comes to the divine feminine, the number of archetypes out there, they're really countless and infinite. There's just so many to talk about. So I felt inspired to talk about the maiden, the mother, and the crone, because I feel that these archetypal energies come closest to who we are as human beings trying to navigate this 3D world. These are archetypes that I feel that all women will experience at some point in their life. And even though they are archetypal models, at the same time, they're also living energies that are present inside of us. For instance, I see you as a wise elder. So I would put you, as holding the archetype of the crone. For me, I'm currently, even though I'm not biologically a mother, I'm currently in the phase of my life where I am feeling very fully into the archetype of the mother. But even with that being said, I feel that we still carry with us the maiden energy that stays with us throughout the rest of our lives. It was the very first part of the divine feminine archetype that we embodied and that we came across when we were growing up as little girls. And we still continue to interact with that energy. So I feel that for the audience who's watching this, these three archetypes come closest to models or paradigms that we can tune into when we are trying to access our own inner divine feminine. And also, we were talking about how, because these are archetypes, these are models, there is the potential, and it has been, distorted by the toxic patriarchal society that we have been in. So I feel that it's really important to understand these archetypes at their essence, without the diluted or the distorted narratives that have been imposed upon them. Because I feel that as women, when we are trying to live into and embody these feminine energies, we look to, say, other people around us, or we can also look to archetypal models for inspiration. Um, but sometimes it can be hard when there is so much noise out there that gives us, a supposedly idealized form that we are meant to aspire to, but it doesn't quite touch on the full spectrum of the divine feminine that we actually hold. So I wonder whether that would be a good introductory way to go into the archetypes.
That's excellent, Irene. And I just want to also comment that I think it's so profound that those archetypes and different facets of our journeys as women and our experience of embodiment as women are very much associated with the phases of the moon cycle. And
Yeah.
that I do think at that level of sacred embodiment, it is so important for us as women to really honor our deep connection with the lunar cycle, which I know you're very tuned into also. That both our physical experience of ovulation and menstruation, when we're really in tune with the moon, is very in tune with that movement of the lunar cycle from its dark of the moon phase into its waxing phase, full moon, and then the waning phase. And I think that in and of itself speaks to some of what we need to integrate, not only in those phases of our lives, but our monthly experiences and our journeys of going through that cycle of life, death, rebirth in the experiences of our lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out. And I was just sharing with you also that today is the first, it just so happens to be the first day of my bleed. And I'm at the time of my women years where I am transitioning, from being in my menstruating years to hitting perimenopause. So that's also a very interesting phase. And when we're talking about the maiden, the mother, and the crone, yes, we can see them as separate archetypal energies, but just like with the moon cycle, it's actually one and the same, but they flow and blend into each other. So even as a maiden or someone who is, say, in her very early years, she can also touch on and access the wise crone energies that she innately possesses. So it's really beautiful they are tying this in with the lunar energies as well, because that's one way of accessing all three archetypal energies.
Beautifully said. So let's dive deeper into these archetypes and how we reclaim them in their wholeness. Because as we were talking about earlier, there are a lot of distortions that we can get caught in with our own sense of expectations of what that means to be really integrating these different archetypes. So let's dive into it. Do you want to start with the maiden?
Yeah, let's do that. And I think for each archetype, I'll just touch on one potential wound because otherwise this could turn to a very long conversation. But with the maiden, so when I tuned in, I feel like the biggest wounding around the maiden archetype is the idea of sexuality and erotic innocence. And in my work with women, I still come across so many women who struggle with their sexuality because we have been brought up in a society where a woman's sexuality is seen as taboo in many ways, even in Western societies where women's sexuality is supposedly liberal, like women have been liberated in their sexuality. But at the same time, I've worked with a lot of women who come from Western cultures who still feel trapped by a lot of the distortions that have been put in place. What does it mean to be sexually liberated? I feel that again, the biggest reason why a woman's sexuality has been clamped down and suppressed is because there is so much power in a woman's womb, her creative energies, her sexual power, that there is so much power that I think a toxic patriarchal society sees it as dangerous. And it has therefore perpetuated a narrative that it is not good. I'm just thinking back to the 19th century in Victorian times when it really came to a head, this dichotomy between the angel, so that's the innocent housewife, versus the whore, right? The prostitute who is wanton and sexual, and then the men who are caught in between. So not only are women being divided into two very distinct categories where they are pitted against each other, right? You could see them as being in competition with one another, but also the men. they struggle with, where do they fit in? Even though society permits them, for example, to be promiscuous outside and then to still marry. But I mean, at least in a lot of literature that I've read that reflect Victorian times, a lot of the men struggle as well because what affects women ultimately affects the men as well. And that again, right, you can go in a whole nother angle and talk about how there isn't really a difference or a separation between what men and women go through. At the end of the day, we are very much interconnected. And we all go through the same woundings and we all need the same kind of healing. But today, like if we're just talking about the maiden, I think this element of erotic innocence. So I don't know about you, Heather, but for me, growing up in a very conservative Asian culture, and also given the uniqueness of my own family of origin background, my sexuality was seen as like it was meant to be non-existent until I got married. That was how um, conservative my family was. So it was very um, it was very new to me when I first started exploring my own sexuality. I had to unpack the layers of guilt and the shame around that. And it was only much later when it was actually after I got married that I felt that I could give myself permission to explore my sexuality, that I had to go back and unpack all the kind of wounds that were there when I was an adolescent. When I had my first period, my very first, my menarche, and the kind of trauma that was embedded in it because my sexuality was not seen as well, it was not given its full value and worth. It was not seen in its rightful place as a rite of passage that a woman goes through. So, yeah, I'll just take a pause there and see if there's anything you want to add here.
This is so important, and we could easily spend hours just on this part of the conversation because I think that split is so destructive. And as you said, destructive for women and for men. And I do think that we can look to some of the goddess archetypes and how they can support our process of healing that to come into wholeness. And I'm thinking in particular of Lilith, who in the most ancient myths coming out of Sumer was the handmaid of Inanna, the priestess overseeing the sacred temples, the temples of sacred sexuality. And if we can trace back to those earlier understandings of that maiden energy, that power of sacred sexuality, it was that realization that sexuality is a path to spiritual expansion.
Mm.
And when we fully integrate that as women, we understand the power, the gift, the incredible value of honoring that sacred sexuality and that part of ourselves. But as we moved into the patriarchal period, Lilith and that archetype becomes increasingly demonized. And until at the time of the Inquisitions, many women who were persecuted or burned at the stake were called Liliths. Because in a patriarchal context where it is about power over and control, sexuality has to be controlled and a part of ownership or a part of the way in which it gets split off from those sacred roots. Otherwise, it is a profound, empowering path to spiritual wisdom and consciousness and expansion.
Yeah. When you mentioned Lilith, I was also thinking of the story of Adam and Eve, with Lilith being Adam's first wife. And yeah, we could go into the whole story there as well, that and it's quite sexual in the sense that Lilith wanted to be on top of Adam, and Adam was not happy about that. And so he told God to give him another wife. And that was how Eve was created. But even that split, and then how Lilith then became demonized as a child eater. Yeah, there's just so much there that I feel in in our culture, like a woman's sexuality, her desire to experience her sexuality. So much of that has been denied. Um,
And
Largely,
that was so the theme of that initial story of Adam and Eve is the beginning of the patriarchal period. And that split occurs. And Lilith was really wanting to honor her own sacred sexuality and the meaning of true mutuality in relationship. And Adam was basically saying, no, I need to be on top in every sense. And so
mm,
it really created this split that then is part of the wound that men carry, part of the wound that we women carry around that power of the sacred sexual energy.
yes, and I feel that very much, at the maiden stage. So I mentioned that I had to do a lot of healing and unpacking of wounds. That was when I was, moving into my mother phase. But it's very much possible to go to the past and do the healing work, as you well know, Heather. So I found that it was very empowering for me to go into sacred ceremony with my younger self, younger parts of myself um that had this erotic innocence, right? The pleasure,
Mhm.
taking pleasure in sensuality and sexuality, and not seeing that as separate from my spiritual desires as well. Because again, right, you're talking about that split, that for a woman to be seen as spiritual, and I actually see this a lot in, for example, in Puritanism, right? That was very strong, where a woman was not meant to be sexual at all. She was meant to obey and honor her husband, but she herself was not meant to have any enjoyment or pleasure in the act of physical intimacy. And that her role was just to be the mother of their children. And that was it. So I don't know whether you want to move on to the mother archetype now, or do you still want to spend some time talking about the maiden?
Just to add one piece to that, I think some of what's been damaging too within Christianity is that way in which Mary Magdalene has been labeled as a whore or a prostitute. And there's increasing evidence and understanding that she and Christ were in a sacred relationship as beloveds. And again, it's that sense of splitting off spirituality from sexuality so that you have, the Virgin Mary, and yet you have Mary Magdalene as the sexual one who's a prostitute. So I think that is so important that we reweave that back into wholeness, that again, sacred sexuality is a path to spirituality, not separate from it. So it's really important.
And in bringing up Mary Magdalene and Mother Mary, that actually moves us really well into the woundings around the mother archetype. Because again, you have this idealization of the perfect mother figure who is, well, in some circles, right? And it really depends on how you look at the word virgin, because the word itself has many connotations. So whether she was truly a virgin, there are some people who believe that, or whether she did have sexual relations. That is also, like another path that we can go towards. But this whole idea of the idealization of the perfect mother, yes, she would need to have physical sexual relationship in order to bear a child. Um, but that's not her prime, that's not how she's primarily painted as, right? She's seen as this motherly, perfect, unconditional love that she pours forth to her children, and that she's not meant to have any other desires of her own other than to love and to care and to give to her children, and by extension, her entire family. So I feel that that actually is one of the greatest distortions there are about the mother archetype, because what happens is that there are a lot of mothers, a lot of women who face challenges and issues that they feel cannot be expressed, that cannot be talked about, For instance, the experience of postnatal depression, which is very, very real. It's something that actually my mother experienced. But during her generation, during her time, it was not seen as something that could be discussed openly. It was not even recognized as a potential problem or a symptom, and that women actually need support. There is this misconception that women are just born knowing to be perfect mothers and that they don't need to be taught. It's just innately part of their instinctual makeup. That to me is a very dangerous narrative that a toxic patriarchal society perpetuates because it's very damaging to a woman's sense of who she is. Does she feel less than and with no value at all if she makes the decision not to bear any children, or if she has needs and desires of her own that are different from solely looking after her children? Yeah.
That is so true and so insightful. And I know that one of the wounds that was in my mother line that I really had to work through in my own life was this wound of these women who were highly intelligent, highly creative, who felt constricted and constrained to only have their identity as mothers, wives, and mothers. And so there was this underlying anger that they experienced in not being able to be fully in their own creative gifts in the world. And I think that's really important, as you said, that we reclaim a more holistic understanding of the sacred feminine so that women don't feel caught in this constriction of what it means to be the perfect mother that plays out even for those of us women who don't have children in being the perfect caretakers to others, always being a caregiver and a caretaker, and that's our value when it really is about how do we also honor our own needs and gifts and who we are as whole people.
Yeah, and that phrase that you said earlier, like I feel that that truly encapsulates the archetypal energies of the mother, owning our creative gifts. It does not need to be physical reproduction of children. It can be, say, a project, writing a book, in our careers, whatever it is that calls to us and speaks to us in a very personal and unique way. And that's how, I feel that toxic patriarchy has kept women subjugated, that their primary role was to produce children. And you see that in like dystopian novels like The Handmaid's Tale. But I think we're also awakening to a different paradigm of what it really means to embody the mother archetype. Yes, there is this, divine feminine gifting, offering of from our hearts and from our wombs, but it comes from a place that is generative and it's generous, i.e., it's generative because that there is a flow. It doesn't just stop. It's not just giving. Um, a mother also knows how to receive, to receive
Mhm.
nourishment and support so that she can in turn put out her nurturing gifts to the world, to her children, to whoever it is, whatever project that she is caretaking. So I feel that when it comes to embodying and healing that archetypal wound of what the mother what the mother model carries. It's about recognizing that we as women need to first receive before we can give. And that in itself is a core wound, right? What does it mean to receive? Again, when I think of the roles that a lot of women had generations ago when they were not allowed to work, they were primarily housewives and they looked after the home. They were not economically compensated for it. And I find that a lot of women today, they still struggle. It's actually one of the struggles that I personally face when I was working in an institution and I was being paid. It felt comfortable because I was doing work in service to the educational system that I was a part of. But when it came to having my own business and selling my services, it started to get quite personal. And I found it challenging to charge what I believed that I was worth and to see that my services have a value that a traditional, conventional patriarchal society has not necessarily prioritized as important or significant. And that a lot of my own personal healing has had to do around, stepping out in my business, putting my offerings out there, and feeling worthy enough to receive, to have a reciprocal exchange for what I give. So I wonder if that's something that you can relate to as well, Heather.
Yes, and I think that theme of and what you're talking about that I think is so important is how do we honor our gifts and really honor what is a value that we uniquely have that we're bringing and birthing into the world. And also, I think that whole theme of honoring that cycle of giving and receiving, of doing and being, is a really critical one for us as women and men. But I think for us as women in particular, some of that stereotype that we've gotten caught in being the idealized mothers, caretakers, givers, is that somehow it's wrong to receive, or it's somehow not all right to be vulnerable or to have your own needs and value those needs. So how else would you see that getting worked out and healed for women around not only the financial valuing of their gifts, but the emotional valuing of what they need to receive to be empowered in themselves?
And I feel that, coming back to this idea of honoring our lunar energies and just even being recognizing and being aware of the moon cycle, the fact that there's a period of waxing, waning, there's a period of light and dark, and that we need to honor both, not just when the moon is full and bright, but when it is dark, and an honoring of those energies. So I remember, and this is something that I share in the work that I do with women to highlight to them the importance of each phase of their menstrual cycle. A lot of women struggle, for example, with PMS, premenstrual syndrome. And there are all kinds of reframes we can put on that. One of the more popular ones is to see PMS as a need to please make space. Because oftentimes when women are caught up in the doing, the giving, putting ourselves out there, we forget that we also need to feed ourselves. And when we don't, when we hit this phase in our menstrual cycle, when our hormones have fluctuated and we are less, what's that word? We are less able to just conform and accept. This is when the irritation and the criticalness will come up. So it's actually a sign, it's a message from our bodies telling us that we need to nurture our energies before we can, go enter into the new phase of the next cycle where we are again putting ourselves out there. So just this recognition that as women, we are cyclical beings and that we have to honor, even if the toxic patriarchal society around us does not, we need to honor the rhythms and natures of our own bodies, of our own energies, and to say, okay, I'm at the phase in my cycle now where I have to make space for me. If that means saying no to other appointments, if it means having to say, to putting on hold what other people want us to do, to not feel guilty or bad about it, but to say that it's necessary for me to take care of myself so that when I do step out and care for other people, I can do so from a generative and a generous, like a truly generous space, and not from a place of wounded people pleasing or wanting to be liked, etc.
Part of what you're saying, Irene, that I think is so important is that we come back into that deep connection with the natural cycles of the moon and also of the earth, because then we are more in balance in our own bodies and we are more in balance in terms of honoring those cycles of light and dark, of action and rest. You know, the it's so interesting. There's a book called Her Blood is Gold. I'm blocking on who the author is, but I'll put that below the video, who talked about how profound it is when we as women really honor that connection between our cycles and the cycles of the moon. And I know in my own life, I had really intense issues with menstrual cramps and pain during my periods. And after I read that book and I started honoring and connecting with the moon and the cycles of the moon and just attuning to that again in my body, all of that shifted. And also, as we reconnect with the energies of the earth and know that we go through those seasonal cycles, that the season of winter is the time of rest when the earth pulls its energies in to really restore the energy needed to then give birth to the spring. So when we're really tuning into those natural cycles, we're more in balance, we're more in deep connection with the earth and the sky with the moon. And then we are honoring that being in balance in terms of that cycle of activity and then of rest, of giving and of receiving. That is the natural cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may share like a personal story of how I have learned to honor my cycle as well. As I shared earlier, today is the first day of my bleed. And for many years now, when I started practicing menstrual cycle awareness, I would use the first day of my bleed as a red tent. It would be a day where I would just give myself full permission to rest. It's a lot easier now that I'm in charge of my own schedule and my time. But even when I was at work, there would be ways that I would find around it in which I could protect my own energetic space. Because when a woman is on her bleed, that's also when she's very psychically open and very sensitive. And it's something to honor and to protect. So just to say, we're having this interview, it's nighttime for me now. I spent the whole of my day just resting so that I can be fully present here with you. But if I hadn't done that, I don't think I would have been able to show up with the kind of energy that I wanted to give and to share. So that's my way of honoring my energy, while still meeting the needs of, this call that we've scheduled months back. I didn't want to have to reschedule because um, I mean, I understand that your time is very tight, but it's also possible to honor our commitment as well as honor myself and my needs. I do know that it's a struggle for a lot of women. So I can only share from my own personal example of when I was working and now when I do have my own business, it does make it easier. But I canceled the meeting with my virtual assistant earlier this morning because I knew that I was going to be on my bleed. So I canceled that. And then I met the one commitment that I felt that I really wanted to honor and to be able to show up, in honor of my own divine feminine and also to be in service of the divine feminine. So having said that, yeah, that feels really beautiful that we're having this conversation today.
That is so beautiful, Irene. And I think you're so beautifully describing how we can hold that balance and honor those natural cycles. And I think what you said about the red tent is so important too, because that was a pattern in ancient times where the women who would go in attunement to the lunar cycle would bleed at the time of the dark of the moon and go off to the red tent to meditate, to honor that time of more psychic openness and meditate and often bring back visions or wisdom to the community because they're honoring that time of darkness, that time of receiving, that time in their own body cycles. That's a very powerful time, but we don't honor it if we override it and ignore the gifts of the wisdom of the time of the dark and the dark of the moon and that time in our cycles. So I so respect that you're really honoring that in yourself.
Exactly. This notion of overriding, it's what I grew up with. All the advertisements out there, right? That, oh, you can be on your bleed and you can still go off and do all kinds of supernatural feats. Those are the advertising that I received, and I grew up thinking that, okay, even if I'm on my period, I'm not allowed or I shouldn't complain, that I would rather rest, So I do feel it's very important in this day and age, especially, for the next generation, for them to really honor that when they're on their bleed, it's not seen as it should not be seen as an inconvenience. It should be honored as for the gifts that it brings. And you're exactly right in saying that in ancient times, when women were on their bleed, they were revered and honored for the visions and the oracular wisdom that they brought back after they returned from the red tent. In a lot of religious acculturation these days, um, when a woman is on her bleed, it's seen as taboo. Oh, she's not allowed to enter into a temple.
Unclean.
Exactly. And I just think, wow, that is wrong. It is such a huge distortion. Yeah.
So let's talk about the crone.
Would you like to share before I chime
No, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
in? Well, this one is a very interesting one for me because I grew up as a little girl with both of my grandmothers having passed on. So I never got to meet them, and I never had the experience of having biological grandmothers in my life. So much later in life, when I was getting in touch and connecting with these archetypal energies, I was very curious and interested to see what my own embodied experience of that would be like. And the crone energy, again, there are these distortions, right? On the one hand, you have the wise, grandmotherly, loving elder. Then on the other hand, you also have, this is how a lot of witches are portrayed. Cranky, irritable, vindictive. They have a lot of power, but they abuse it. Anytime that you upset them, they'll cast a spell or put a curse on you. So you have, these two very extreme opposing ends of the spectrum. But what it boils down to, the way I see it, crone energy carries the wisdom and knowledge of life experience. And she does have a lot of power because this is wisdom that she has earned and she has gained. However, I do feel that in the toxic patriarchal society that we are still living in, the distortions around, aging and how women are still under this pressure to look young, to stay young, to say, I don't know, Botox maybe in some cultures, or dyeing their hair and trying to look younger than they biologically are. And the kind of praise and adulation that is given to women when they're told, oh, you don't look your age at all. But when we really think deeper, why wouldn't you want to look your age? Why wouldn't you want to embrace all of the years that you have lived and that now show on your face and on your body? Why isn't there this reverence? So what's interesting to me also is that it's been reflected to me that, oh, in Eastern cultures, the elderly tend to be more respected. They tend to be more revered for their wisdom. I find that perhaps there is some truth in this stereotype, but it's not necessarily the case. There still is a lot of pressure on women to look young, to stay young.
Mm.
And also just to say that I personally feel that a crone's wisdom has to be lived into and it has to be earned in a way. Because not every woman who has reached a certain age has embodied the wisdom of a crone. If, for instance, because of the feminine woundings that a woman may have experienced, as she was going through life, she could end up in her older years feeling a lot of regret, a lot of bitterness, a lot of grief that is unprocessed, and that would then come out in an unhealthy and also a very toxic way. So I feel that we we don't have as many healthy role models who embody their crone years as we do say of perhaps the maiden or the mother. And I wonder if you would agree with me on this.
I think that is so true. And again, I think it is because of those expectations that are put on women in the patriarchal culture. And I think you really outlined that so beautifully and clearly. And I think, I've also seen so many women as they age, not only feeling that need to keep looking young to feel like they have any value in the society, but the way in which then older women often are ignored or devalued and seen as having no worth. And that then can activate some of that resentment and anger and that sense of struggle to really claim the gifts of what it means to be the crone. So I don't know that we have a lot of good role models, but one of the teachings that I had from uh, a Mohawk medicine woman I worked with for a number of years, she talked about how in her tradition, it was understood that when you go through menopause as a woman, that's when you move into the crone years. And that blood that and the menstrual cycle that had been, the creativity coming from the womb in whatever expression, whether it's children or it's your own creativity, the blood is now held, that sacred blood is now held within the body to empower the woman to be in her full wisdom and empowerment. And it's interesting that menopause often comes sometime close to the second Saturn return, which I think is that developmental phase when we really shift from that mid phase in life where it has been about our professional life, our mothering, our putting our energy out into the world, to moving into that time to be more and more spiritually oriented around how are we stepping into that deeper wisdom to be bringing those gifts out in the world in this time. So I think there's so much power in that deeper understanding of the crone if we really honor that as women and work with that. And again, it's correlated with the final phases of the waning moon and honoring that balsamic phase of the moon, which is the time of distilling all of the wisdom, all of the life experiences of that cycle to really honor that and then be able to emanate that to others. So I think there is so much power in that phase if we can honor its deeper meaning.
Yeah, and if I may share, like when I was connecting with the archetypal energy of the crone, the grandmother, and myself, what I sensed from that energy was this idea of like when I connect with my grandmother energy, uh, it's a sense of, she tells me that you are worth it. There is no time to waste. It's a very no nonsense kind of power energy where she's steeped in her life experience and her worth, and she says, you're not holding back anymore. So that's actually an energy that I connect with whenever I still struggle through my very human challenges of embodying my own worth and sitting truly in my value. I just tap into that crone energy because it is so wise and it is so powerful. And there is a strength and a power there that I think hasn't been celebrated enough. Again, when I think of those feminine woundings and what you were talking about of how older women feel ignored in society, and I can see how a lot of younger women, if they have absorbed some of those toxic narratives, they may feel an aversion to women who are older because it's a reminder that one day that's a stage that they will have to enter into. And they're not prepared, they're not ready because they've bought into the distortions of a toxic patriarchal society. So in that in itself, you can see already the separation, right, between maiden mother and the grandmother. And there are also clear separations and clear woundings between, say, the maiden and the mother, right? A daughter and her mother, the kind of woundings that are there as well. So I do feel that in the reclamation of our divine feminine essence, these three archetypes, integrating them after healing and connecting with each of them, knowing that as women, we each carry all three of these archetypal energies. What does it mean to integrate all three of them into our lives? And what would it mean then after integrating, were we to then connect and interact with other women in our lives. We were talking very briefly about the kind of woundings that women experience with each other, the sense that it's not safe because of the competition, the comparison. Um, and how I feel that when we manage to heal and integrate these energies inside of ourselves, we are then able to step out from an empowered place and give other women permission to step into these energies, the powers that these energies hold as well. And we are a reflection to the kind of wholeness that they can also be in.
That is so powerful, Irene. Both what you're saying in terms of how do we integrate all of those aspects within ourselves because they are in all of us, but also how do we reclaim those archetypes in their wholeness so that we're not caught in the shadow aspects of them or the distortions of them or the wounds of how they've been portrayed in the patriarchal culture. And I just want to comment on another aspect of the grandmothers, in that I think that was so profound in so many indigenous cultures. The leadership would be the council of grandmothers, who also hold that awareness of the seven generations and that really honoring of our experience of mortality, because that's another aspect of that crone phase, honoring the cycle of life, death, rebirth, and knowing then that the elders hold that wisdom of supporting and honoring what's needed for the coming generations and not getting caught in our own ego and our own sense of self-importance. So I think there's also something in that phase of the grandmothers or the crone of really facing the issues of mortality and immortality, because that's another lesson of the lunar cycle, that we go through this process of incarnation, embodiment, come into the fullness of who we are, the full expression of our uniqueness. Then we go into those years of wisdom as we're coming to the waning cycle, to go into the dark of the moon, to die and be reborn again. So I think there's another important piece in that too, in it gets us beyond our ego to honoring that soul self that is infinite, but goes through these incarnational cycles of life, death, rebirth, and to honor how that is the natural cycle of all of life.
Yes, yes. And in fact, yeah, I was smiling because that's how my when I tap into my crone energy, that's what it's felt like. In my egoic tripping out of not wanting to put myself out there, wanting to hide, for example, the grandmother comes in and says, there's no time to waste. It's now. Like, don't hold back any longer. And so this wisdom of the grandmothers that you're speaking into, I feel that it's very much, it carries the wisdom of it's time for the sacred feminine to rise, and it's time to stop holding back for whatever, ego-driven reasons they may be, all the fears and the concerns, because there's something that is much bigger at stake.
So, say a little bit more about how we heal this to be honoring these deeper archetypes in ourselves, because I think it means daring to break out of the conventional stereotypes and distortions that we get caught in as women. It means reclaiming that more ancient wisdom. It means honoring the cycle of the moon as much as we honor the light of the sun. So, say a little bit more about how we can heal that to be coming into that wholeness of these archetypes within ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And it's a really beautiful one because I feel that, especially for the audience who's watching this, they are on that evolutionary soul path of wanting to heal and to integrate. I'd like to speak into some of the potential problems that may arise when a question like that is posed, which is the conventional paradigm is to, okay, if you want to heal, let's just do something. Let's just keep, for instance, if the wounding is around stepping up, then let's just take action. Let's just step up. But I feel that the root of the wounding has to do with a lack of appreciation of our worth as women, of the
Mm,
divine feminine essence that
mm,
we carry. And so the solution is not necessarily to go out there and take action. The remedy or the antidote is to first and foremost come to a full and deeper appreciation of the value that we carry, and then to step forth from that place. So the idea of inner alignment before we go out and take, what external action we may desire. First and foremost is about coming back to a full recognition. And I feel that there aren't actually that many avenues that offer this. Um, and if it's okay, I think that I would like to speak a little bit about why I felt inspired to come up with a program that I'm launching soon. It's called Treasure, because I found that there was this missing gap. A lot of the one-on-one work that I do with women, they may be wanting to launch their business, or they're experiencing heartbreak in a relationship, and they're looking to solve, right, to find a resolution, to heal from whatever woundings there are. And again and again and again, I find that we keep coming back to, first and foremost, coming back to who they are. How are they valuing themselves? How are they seeing themselves? Are they fully able to appreciate the gifts that they have? Because a lot of the time we are taught to look outwards. It's the career that will show me how valuable I am. It's the achievements, the relationship that I have. Um, but a lot of the time there is a forgetting. And so I feel it's important to come back to a remembering, bringing back together these parts of ourselves that we may have put aside, cast aside as shadow, that we may have denied and ignored or suppressed. And it's time to really excavate, to dig deep, and to see the true treasure that they actually hold for us. All the uncomfortable feelings that may arise when we're in relationship with other women, for example. What valuable messages are there for us, to grow and to evolve towards? So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I feel that the way forward is really to turn inward and to find a way to come into full appreciation of our divine feminine gifts, the treasure that we hold as carriers of the sacred feminine.
And I love how you said before we got on the video how that word treasure is both a noun and a verb.
Yes. Yeah, because when you treasure something, when you value something, you know it's precious and you love it. You take good care of it. And again, one of the biggest feminine woundings out there is that women overgive, as and it's almost as if it's a form of compensation because they're afraid they don't dare to look after themselves or to speak up for their needs and desires and to say, I am worth it. But if they're able to treasure who they are, then they'll be able to assert themselves, not necessarily with violence, but with firm, gracious awareness that they are worth it. And then to treasure, right? It's sort of saying that love is a verb, right? We take action. What would you do if you treasured something or someone? You would take action to protect it, to value, to show appreciation, to honor, to put the person or thing into a reverence, right? So I feel that that's really important for a woman to be able to own her treasure and then to be able to treasure herself as well as the treasure that she is.
I think it's wonderful that you're doing this program, Irene, and I'll put the link below. I think this is so critical and such an important time that you're doing this program. And I think what you said is so profound that the path to healing these wounds and coming into our wholeness is not to do something, but to go within, not only to reclaim that treasure within ourselves, but to remember that wisdom that is within us and to really honor the sacredness of our bodies and how they naturally are in tune with these natural cycles if we listen to the wisdom of our bodies and if we listen to the wisdom of the sacred feminine energies within us. And in Circle, which is part of your program, in Sacred Circle, as I know, having done it for many years, we can then mirror that back to each other. Yes, we will experience some of the shadow aspects of how we interact with each other, given the wounds we experience in this enculturation. But in a sacred circle, there is that capacity to remember together and to be mirroring back that sacred feminine wisdom and value to each other to move into that wholeness and empowerment. So it's beautiful that you're doing this program.
Yeah, and if I could share, I'd just like to speak into something that's very personal for me, which is that I oftentimes hear from women who want to work with me. They'll tell me, "Oh, I'm drawn to you because you have something that I want." It to me, it takes great vulnerability to be able to share that, because of course, the distorted shadow aspect of that is envy and jealousy and even rage and bitterness. Like, how dare you have this? How dare you own this? But this idea of being in circle, where it's a safe space to be held, to be seen, and to be witnessed for everything that is arising in you, I feel that that is so important. And it's rare. It's still rare in this day and age to have containers where women can step more fully into their authentic beings and to practice being in right relationship with other women. But that's also where a lot of the healing takes place. Not so much when we're doing the work alone, even though that is also an important piece, but also when we are together in energetic space with other women. When you talked about that mirroring, right? And in neuroscience, you talk about this idea of mirror neurons, how we learn. There are transmissions and frequencies that are shared when we come into space with one another. Earlier on, we were talking about the idea of the red tent, right? When women used to menstruate at the same time in the past, because that's how we are hormonally syncing with each other. And I feel that so much of that is missing in this day and age, that connection. What we have instead is the separation, the distorted narratives of scarcity that puts women in competition with each other. To heal that, it's important to come into community, to be in right relationship with other women, and to practice that in a safe space, that when shadow does come out, that when triggers do get activated, there is a space that is holding enough to meet all of that versus everyone getting triggered left, right, center, and then everybody's just reacting. So yeah, I'm speaking personally into this because that had been my own personal experience. And so it's something I'm very sensitive to. And it's also something that I'm acutely aware is very much needed. Uh yeah, especially in the times that we're living in now, when everything is accelerating and there's just so much. Yeah.
And it is such a critical transition time as we're moving into the age of Aquarius and called to rebalance the energies of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, that we need to have these safe circles and containers to reclaim what that sacred feminine wisdom and archetypal energy actually is, so that we can embody it and emanate it and be really birthing these new paradigms and new ways of being in how we are in right relationship within ourselves and with each other. So this is beautiful that you're doing this work, and having my own years of sitting in sacred circle and facilitating that, I know what a powerful healing container that can be, to be transforming our own lives. And then I truly believe as we can gather in these kinds of healing circles, then it can create this morphogenic field that then emanates out and begins to shift the energies of our global community and support us in moving into these new paradigms.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know why, but the word priceless just keeps coming. Like, this is truly priceless, right? This is the treasure and the value of women healing, integrating, rising together. that's what's so needed in the world right now.
Well, thank you for being in this conversation. Thank you for the work that you're doing, Irene. And I just want to thank again this community for how we're supporting each other in being in this journey of healing and transforming together. So,
Mm.
blessings and love to all of you.
Mm. Blessings.